On February 24th, the Sacramento Kings would face off against the LA Clippers, in a game that would eventually become one of the craziest games in basketball history. And late in the fourth quarter of the high-scoring game, this happened.
Leonard picked up by Barnes. It's laughable at this point.
Kawhi Leonard didn't know it at the time, but this shot would make NBA history. It may not seem like much at first, but this shot would actually turn out to be possibly one of the most significant shots of the entire season. This was the shot that gave Kawhi his 40th point of the night, and the reason why that's so significant is because that meant that this was the 143rd time this season that a player had scored 40 or more points in a game, which broke the previous record of 142 40-point games, which was set all the way back in 1962. A 61-year-old record was broken with nearly 2 months left in the season. But just a few minutes later, De'Aaron Fox of the Sacramento Kings would also hit the 40-point mark, followed by his own teammate Malik Monk, all in a game that would become possibly one of the greatest games that we've ever seen. But that's just a glimpse of all the insane performances we've been seeing recently, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about this season, some of the records that have been set, and why we have never seen a season quite like this. So let's get into the video. Over the last few years, we've seen a steady increase in offensive production from the league's top players. With the combination of various rule changes, the increase in three-point shot volume, and just a faster pace, offense in the NBA was bound to explode sooner or later, and this season is the result of that. I made a video sort of talking about this last month, but that already feels a little bit dated because that's how over-the-top insane this season has been, and it might have peaked in that game that was played a few nights ago. Like I said before, this game between the LA Clippers and Sacramento Kings would end up being one of the most outrageous games in the history of basketball. After Malik Monk tied the game at 153 at the end of regulation, the game would eventually go into double overtime and finish with a final score of 176 to 175, the second most points ever scored in an NBA game. And another part of this that made it even better was the fact that this game was actually important for playoff seeding in the Western Conference, because throughout the season, teams in the West have been about as close together as we've ever seen. We've had close fights between maybe 2 or 3 teams for a specific seed, but I don't think we've seen so many teams with the possibility of ending up anywhere in the standings. The top 3 teams in the Denver Nuggets, Memphis Grizzlies, and Sacramento Kings are pretty much safe, and even then I probably wouldn't give that to Sacramento just yet. But every team from 4 through 13 is likely going to be moving around a lot these last few weeks. These teams are so close together that there have been times where teams will be shifting seeding positions on days where they didn't even have a game. It's just been crazy to see, and again, a reason why this Clippers-Kings game was so insane. And like I mentioned earlier, this game contained 3 40-point games. Kawhi Leonard dropping 44, De'Aaron Fox dropping 42, and Malik Monk dropping 45 off the bench. I mentioned that because this was just the 16th time in history where a player has scored 45 or more points off the bench. It was the 18th time where 2 teammates both went for 40 in the same game, and it marks just the 3rd time in history where those 2 teammates were a starter and a bench player. And some of you may think, well, it had to be because there was no defense. And you'd be correct to some degree, but the simple fact is that there was just a high level of tough shot making from both teams the entire night. I wouldn't consider these shot attempts easy or bad defense. Everyone was just hitting, which is pretty much the story of the season. Because like I said before, we are in the midst of possibly the greatest scoring season in the history of the NBA, already up to 148 40-point games at the time of this recording, which, based on how the season is going, this number will likely be even higher by the time you see this. Because the rate at which these games are happening, we will likely end the season at around 190 games of 40 or more points. An insane level of offensive production, but it isn't just limited to 40-point games, because we've been seeing players go for way more than that the entire season. To put it into perspective, this season, we've already had 12 different players score 50 or more points in a game, which means that with just under 2 months left in the season, we are already approaching the record for most players to score 50 or more points, the record being 14 different players, which was set last season. And a big reason we're seeing such a big spike in high-scoring games is partially only due to the rising skill level of star players, but also due to the rise of the three-point shot, which is something that has been discussed time and time again throughout the last 5 or 6 seasons. But I don't think we've ever seen it like this, because we are now at a point where a good shooter hitting 10 or more threes in a game is almost expected. We are no longer in the era where a player hitting 8 or more threes in the game is news everywhere for the next week. Shooting performances like this aren't necessarily common, but they are definitely a lot more common than they used to be, as evident by this stat. This season, there have already been 11 games in which a player has made 10 or more threes, already tied for the second most all time, only trailing the 2021 season. As you might expect, a good portion of these games belong to Stephen Curry, but this season is a bit different in that he's missed a lot of time due to various injuries, so I'd be prepared to argue that this season is actually more impressive because of the amount of players that are having these types of games, and that's cool and all, but this is where it gets crazy, because while 10 threes is definitely an exclusive club, the threshold of more than 10 threes is one that has been reserved for only a handful of players throughout NBA history. Back on April 18th, 1996, Dennis Scott of the Orlando Magic became the first player to hit 11 or more threes in a game when he hit 11 of his 17 attempts against the Atlanta Hawks. This was during one of the 3 seasons when the NBA shortened the three-point line from the normal 23 feet 9 inches to 22 feet around the entire arc instead of just in the corners. If we want to find a game like this with a normal three-point line, then we need to go forward 7 seasons to when Kobe Bryant hit 12 threes against the Seattle Supersonics in 2003. After that, Donyell Marshall would hit 12 threes in the game in 2005, and J.R. Smith would hit 11 threes in 2009, followed by 2 more games from Deron Williams and Stephen Curry, both in 2013. And that's the history of these games before the 2015 season. Just 6 games with 11 or more threes in the first 35 years the three-point line had been implemented. But of course, after 2015, we all know what happens. And that leads us to where we are today, where we currently have 6 games this season where a player has hit 11 or more threes. 6 games in 4 months versus 6 games in 35 years. But if we truly want to talk about history, we need to talk about the shooters that are setting the most records so far this season, which have been Klay Thompson and Damian Lillard, because over the same weekend, they both made history. Klay Thompson became the first player in NBA history to hit 12 or more threes in multiple games in a single season, and Damian Lillard became just the 4th player to ever hit 13 or more threes in a single game. And with those performances, this is now the only season in NBA history where multiple players had games with 12 or more threes. Going back to Damian Lillard, the game that he had was particularly special. Even though he did hit 13 threes, that part of the game was completely overshadowed by this.
Into the lane, running right-hander up and in, Damian Lillard with that runner. 71 points, a career high.
71 points, which is interesting because we're getting to a point where this wasn't even that surprising. It could be because we've already seen another 70-point game this season, but I think it's also a testament to how great Damian Lillard has been this season, because at 32 years old, he is having probably the best season of his entire career, shooting the highest field goal percentage of his career and averaging his most points at over 32 per game, which means that he is on pace to win the first scoring title of his career. Except he isn't. Because even though Damian Lillard is averaging more points than 26 of the last 30 scoring champions, he finds himself 3rd behind Joel Embiid at 33 points per game and Luka Doncic at 33.1. And we are currently on pace to tie the record for most players averaging 30 or more points with 6. And even then, you still can't even be sure, because of players like Stephen Curry and Kevin Durant, who are right outside the list and can easily make it in before the season is over. This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. We are getting the privilege of witnessing all these different records at the same time. And I'm not sure whether this season will end up being an outlier or if this is a sign of more to come. But one thing I do know is that fans seem to be somewhat split about whether they actually like this season or not. And I can't really understand why. I've made some videos already sort of talking about some of the negatives about this season, mainly to do with the fact that greatness like this is becoming more normalized. But I don't think it's making the season bad, like like some people seem to believe. There are some questionable things about this year, and you can definitely have your opinions. But my problem is with reducing everything that has happened to just, oh, this season sucks, or oh, basketball is ruined. That, in my opinion, is just not a good way to evaluate what we're actually seeing right now, because seasons like this don't happen that often. And the way I see it is that we should just enjoy what's in front of us, because we have never seen an NBA season like this before. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new, hit the bell to be notified when I upload, comment down below what you want to see next, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.